Anne Frank was one of more than 60 million people to die in World War II. Today, she's remembered for her remarkable diary documenting her 2 years hiding in Amsterdam from the occupying Nazis. 3,000 copies of the diary were first printed in 1947. Today, 30 million copies of the diary have been printed, and it's been translated into more than 60 languages. From the book came a Pulitzer Prize and Tony Award-winning play, and then an Academy Award-winning film. How did this one individual, a teenage girl, come to represent the loss and suffering of the war for so many and resonate in the post-war world? How did this young girl turn into a phenomenon? I'm Jeremy Collins, Senior Director of Programs at the National World War II Museum's Jenny Craig Institute for the Study of War and Democracy, and I'm joined by David Barnouw. David Barnouw is an independent scholar and emeritus researcher and former director of communications at the Dutch Institute for War, Holocaust, and Genocide Studies. He has written more than 15 books, including The Phenomenon of Anne Frank. David, thanks for joining us. Though most of our listeners know about Anne Frank and her diary, can you give us an overview, including why and when did Anne start writing?
She started to write a diary, but it was not in a diary. It was in a so-called notebook, what girls would get on their anniversary. And they give it to uncles or friends to write little poems in it. This was 2 weeks before they went into hiding. We're talking about June 1942. And she decided not to use it as a poems book, but to decide it as a diary. And especially when she, 2 weeks after she got it, they moved into hiding. And then she realized, these are exceptional times. So I want to write about it. And then it became a diary. And she wrote in it until the end, until the Germans invaded the house and arrested them.
So over this 2-year period that she's in hiding with her family and others, there become different versions of the diary or addendums to it. Can you please explain where these different versions come from and sort of clarify, were they recreations, were they edited volumes? What are these versions?
And she was just writing almost every day in her diary. The only contact with the outside world were the helpers, but also the radio beams from London, where the Dutch government in exile had their own program, mostly daily, half an hour or an hour, I don't know. And at one time, in March 1944, the Secretary of Education was on air. And he told the audience in the Netherlands that after the war, he thought the war would be over soon, they want to establish an institute to document the war and the occupation. And not only documents of ministers, the Queen, or etc., but also common people. And also letters from people and diaries from people. And is writing about that. What she heard on the radio, and she also writes down that everybody looked at me and my diary, and then she was thinking, they are interested in my diary. And a few weeks later, she is thinking about, they want my diary, but I want to make a book from it. And then she starts to rewrite her whole diary, her own diary, rewrite it, skip things, put more things in it. So we have two versions of, one life in hiding.
Now, she wasn't alone in keeping a diary while hidden in the annex, correct?
Her elder sister Margot also had a diary. We know that from Anne Frank's diary that at one time they were going to read each other's diary. So that's why we know it, but that got lost. It was never found.
Leads me to my next question. How did Anne's diary come to light? You referenced the invasion, the raid on the annex and the deportation of the Frank family and their compatriots who were sent to camps. So how does Otto Frank, who's the sole survivor of his family, how does he get Anne's diary?
when the Germans invaded, one German and 3 Dutch policemen invaded the house, they were also looking for jewelry. They always thought Jews are rich, so we found jewelry. And Silber Bauer, the German one, he was looking for a suitcase to put those stuff in. He found one suitcase and he found only papers in it, so he dropped all the papers on the floor. And when they left the house, the floor was covered with the diary of Anne Frank, her diaries, her first diary and her second diary. And Miep Gies, one of the helpers, collected all the diaries as soon as the Germans had left, kept it in a cupboard, waiting until Anne Frank would come back so she could give it back to her. But Anne didn't come back. Her father, Otto, came back, and after some while it became clear that Anne would never come back. And Miep Gies gave all the diaries to Otto Frank, telling, this is a legacy of your daughter. It belongs now to you.
Now, in my dealings with historians and authors and researchers, they always seem to get a glint in their eye when talking about handling original source documentation. You have seen and worked with the diaries. Can you tell me how they actually look for those who have not seen them in person at the Anne Frank house or any of the archives?
There are different diaries. The most famous one is the first one. It's this red, white, checkered book, and that looks the most like a diary. There used to be a small lock on it with a small key that got lost. The other diaries are just notebooks, and her rewritten version are loose pages, because at that time, March 1944, it wasn't possible to buy real notebooks, but in the office of Otto Frank, there were a lot of loose pages they used for typing activities. So the most famous one is also the one with a lot of pages glued in it. The dates are very different. She put also nice pictures in her diary. It's more a scrapbook than a diary, the first one.
Let's go to Otto Frank. After the war, he is presented with Anne's papers. And how does he come to the decision that they must be published? And then tell us a bit about that publication process.
Otto Frank had a lot of questions from friends and a few relatives who survived. What were you doing those 2 years in hiding? How was it, etc. And he thought, my daughter has written it all down. So at first he made a kind of excerpt of the diary, 100 pages, I think, and sent it to friends and relatives. And then he or others thought, this is interesting enough to make a real publication from it. He had, of course, a problem. There were 2 diaries, and he couldn't go to a publishing house and telling, I'm Otto Frank, you don't know me, and my daughter is Anne, and you don't know her either. But here are 2 diaries. Can you make a book of it? Of course, people said, no, we don't do that, we cannot do that, etc. So Otto Frank decided to use her second version as the base of what we now know, the diary of Anne Frank. But because when the Germans invaded, Anne had not finished her written version. So Otto used her first version to end the diary. And you can say that the diary of Anne Frank, what you buy nowadays in the shop, is a mix of her first and second version. And it was difficult to get a publishing house, but he had one. You have a publishing house, you have editors, and they also change things sometimes, because in this case, it has to be part of a series who had 240 pages, not more. So you had to skip a lot. So it is a combination, everything written by Anne Frank, but changed not in content, but in combination. Edited volume, you can say. Edited partly, first by herself, then a little bit by Otto Frank, and a very tiny bit by the editors of the publishing house.
Now, it's clear Otto was driven by his need to commemorate his family through Anne's diary. In Anne's diary, she is, of course, the central figure. But what did Otto do to commemorate the other members of the family who weren't Anne, who didn't draft their own diary?
It's interesting to see that he did it sometimes by way of censorship. And Frank has written negatively about Germans, you can imagine. But Otto thought, and he told it later, the people who were in hiding and who were killed were Germans too. And a lot of our relatives and friends who were killed were Germans too. So he changed the word Germans in those Germans. So you can say then he also used that for commemoration of the people. We are not completely sure what Otto Frank found in the first year about the diary. It was a legacy of his daughter. It was a story of what happened. And he also decided more people must read it because it's also a story about a young girl who survives more or less in hiding. And also a story about a young girl who loves her daddy and is very critical on her mother. Quite normal stuff for a young person. So it started first as it's my daughter and this is the hiding, and then later on he got more into the ideals of Anne Frank for a better world, world without war, etc.
Now, David, the book is first published in 1947 and subsequently translated into multiple languages. In 1955, after a radio broadcast and quibbling about directors and playwrights, a play based on the diary premieres. The play finds huge success in the United States at a time when a lot of people did not want to hear about what we now know as the Holocaust. Can you tell the audience, why was this play so popular? Why was Anne Frank the exception?
Firstly, I think the play, and it's also the diary, it's not about the Holocaust. It's about the start of the Holocaust. What I always say, there is no blood on the pages. There are few remarks on the Holocaust, but it's more she tells in her dreams, she sees a concentration camp with friends of her. The play in United States became very popular because it wasn't about a terrible time in Europe, but Anne Frank became a very lively American teenager who was in hiding. But in the play, you hardly have any idea why they were in hiding. You don't have an idea they were Jewish. That's the reason why they were in hiding. No, it's kind of very interesting play. A young girl growing up, love her daddy, hates her mother. There is even singing in the play, and in the end, then it's there is hardly an end. It ends with the arrest of the people. You don't see the arrest, but you can hear it. And then Otto Frank comes on stage with the diary in his hand, and he says, yes, I will give a citation of my daughter. In spite of everything, I still believe in the goodness of man, of people. So the people who see the play are very happy. This is a happy end. It doesn't end with, they were killed here, they were killed there. No, it ends with happiness. And what also was downplayed in this play is that those people were Jews. There were discussions to have a Hanukkah song in the play in Hebrew, and they decided not to do it. Otherwise, the audience would find it very strange. So they did it in English. You can say that the diary became more American. I sometimes say that Anne Frank was abducted by the Americans, changed into an American teenager in a play, and then sent back to Europe, where the play was an enormous success too. It's not only the American audience who loved it, but also the audience in Europe. And there you can say they were much closer to the war, of course, than the Americans. And even in Germany, what was divided then already in East and West, on the same night, there were the first nights in East Germans and West German theaters, with and that had a lot of influence. People either went out complete silent, or they applauded for 5-10 minutes. So that made a big impression in Europe. This American play. And after that, the interest in the book became bigger and bigger and bigger.
A central figure in the history of the play is Meyer Levine, who begins the writing of the script and has a long, tumultuous relationship with Otto and any playhouse, production house that wants to stage this play. It is ultimately written by Francis Goodrich and Albert Hackett. What was Meyer's story? What was the problem? And how has this contributed to the legacy of Anne Frank and some of the controversy?
It's a very fascinating story. My Levin was a Jewish war correspondent. He has been in Europe just after the troops, so to say. He has seen the camps. He talked to survivors. So he was very, very, very influenced by what happened. He was one of the first, not the first, but he was the one who was very active in promoting the book to be published in English. He had read it in Paris, where he was with his wife in the late 40s, beginning of the 50s, and he pressed Otto Frank, and he went to a publishing house. It has to be translated into English. And then he went further. He was a playwright too. He wanted to have a play made of it. And he said to Otto Frank, I can do that. And Otto agreed on condition that writing a play, that's one, but you need to find a director to make the play on stage. And he wrote a play, and his version was refused by 10 or 12 or 13 directors. And then Otto Frank said, okay, we have no deal anymore. You cannot do this play. We know the version of My Levin because secretly it has been on stage against all odds. It went. His play is much more Jewish, but also much more Zionist. And the Jewishness Otto Frank could accept, you can say, but the Zionist aspect was not his taste. And he could also say, yeah, where can you see that my little daughter is a Zionist? And when the Goodrich-Hackett play became a success, Meyer Levin became angrier and angrier, sent letters to all the Jewish newspapers, to the New York Times, always complaining that his version was suppressed. And now this non-Jewish version became popular, so that etc. etc. It hindered the rest of his life. That's quite strange. In the beginning, he was in good terms with Otto, but in the end, they saw each other in court, and not a good ending.
Now, the Goodrich-Hackett version, the play premieres October 5th, 1955, and runs for more than 700 performances on Broadway. It receives the Pulitzer and countless other awards, including the Tony. It's staged in different nations, as you mentioned, including Israel, but not in France, which I thought was interesting when I read in your book. Can you give a little bit of Cold War politics into this discussion?
It was a costume that the Pulitzer Prize winner, a play in New York, would go next year in spring, a spring festival in Paris for plays, new plays. But the State Department in Washington warned against it because that would bring back anti-German feelings. And at that time, NATO started to build up, and NATO, Germany had to be part, West Germany, of course, had to be part of NATO. So the State Department warned against this play, what would influence the good relationships, etc. It was, of course, nonsense because it went on show in Germany without any consequence for NATO. But it shows that, everything at that time was used in Cold War ideas.
The success of the play leads to great interest in Hollywood to get the film rights, and then who to direct, and of course who to star as Anne. 20th Century Fox acquires the rights, and it's to be directed by another documentarian of the war and the Holocaust, like Meyer Levin, the great director George Stevens. Can you tell us about the process that Stevens went through in casting, but also in the set design and any on-location elements in Amsterdam?
It was an interesting job for George Stevens because he himself had been in one of the documentary units from the American Army. So he had seen Europe just at the end of the war, of course. And he had filmed a lot. And he even had filmed for his own color. He had some color reels with him. So that's very interesting because Second World War for us is black and white. And he has one of the few color types of it. He was very interested in it, sent his son to Amsterdam to do research. He himself met Otto Frank, and it was much more than, okay, we're in Hollywood, let's roll, and we have a movie. It was also exciting for Amsterdam that Hollywood would come to Amsterdam. And would film there. Not everything, but some of the outside parts are filmed in Amsterdam. The filming of the house behind, so you call it het achterhuis, that was done in Hollywood. They built the house, the annex, at 100%. And the audience could see the different levels where they were living. And they had built the house as such that they could show if there was bombing around, it could shudder. So it was really an interesting way of a presentation, but it was more like a play. You could see all the people doing what they were doing. They couldn't left the house because that was forbidden. So it's more like an in play. And what was new at that moment, the big studios were fighting television, or they thought they were fighting television. So they invented, for instance, CinemaScope, the very wide movie at that moment. And strangely enough, when you have this kind of play, it is not CinemaScope. Nevertheless, it became an interesting movie, but it became a movie what was further away from the real diary than the play. And I know there is a trailer for the play, of course, and that's 100% Hollywood. The thrill of her first kiss, nothing to do with the Holocaust, of course. And he had made what's usual in movies. He had made a first draft of the movie, and it went into a cinema as a surprise film to see how the people reacted. And his end of the movie was Anne Frank in Bergen-Belsen, the camp where she would die. And the audiences were very against it. They disliked this end. They want this end of the book or the play where it ends without blood. But when you end it with somebody in a concentration camp. So that was skipped from it ends now with her last kiss and the sirens of the police cars.
Now, you mentioned the Americanization of Anne Frank, and the play followed by the film sort of leads to a general acceptance by the masses in the United States as Anne Frank and the typical Holocaust experience, or seeing the Holocaust through these eyes of this young girl. But on the flip side of that is the critique that she had an atypical experience. The vast majority of those who suffered in the Holocaust or through Nazi persecution of others was brutal and violent and quick. And here we have 2 years of documentation of growing up, yes, in hiding and fear, but not the immediate horror and death. What does that lose to Anne and her legacy, her experience as an individual, to cut the movie off with a seemingly happy ending, or leaving the viewer with some hope that maybe everything works out all right and let's not get to the rest of the story?
Yeah, it is an exceptional thing that a whole family went into hiding, and friends with them also. Mostly families were divided, and the highest survival rate of Jews in the Netherlands were babies and toddlers who were given away by their parents, how strange it sounds, to completely unknown people, mostly resistance fighters, young students who knew people who would be happy to have a baby. But the parents had no idea what would happen with their children. But those had the highest survival chance. So it's atypical. And you have to say that when you talk about a diary. On the other hand, this ending in the play and in the movie has been changed at the end of the last century. I mean, the movie, no, the play now ends with giving an overview of all the people in hiding and what happened to them. So it's not a happy ending anymore. It's now, this is what it was. 7 of the 8 people were killed. So it's now more closer to history. But whatever you can say, a play is not a book, and a book can never show how history is. And Frank doesn't know a lot about what happened outside. I mean, in 1944, nobody knew about Auschwitz. And even if they heard about it, they couldn't imagine that would be mass slaughter on an hourly basis. So all the knowledge we have is knowledge from after the war, knowledge and Frank didn't have.
I referenced legacy. You have a chapter at the end of your book titled "Who Owns Anne Frank?" We have a statue of Anne Frank outside of our museum. We unveiled it in 2019, and it's a simple statue of a young woman, young girl. And we also have a large gallery in our latest public space, Liberation Pavilion, and it's the entryway to our Holocaust gallery on our campus. This is done in part because the gateway to the Holocaust and to World War II for millions of Americans is the Diary of Anne Frank. This is what many school children are assigned to read in 7th or 8th grade, and it is, like I said, the gateway. So we have certainly been a part of this, and we recognize the value of bringing in an audience, a younger audience, to somebody that they may relate with. So it's something that the museum has not stayed away from. So I don't want to make this sound as if we stay in a corner and others are involved in this, but I think it has been effective on our campus. But what are the challenges to her legacy or portraying her legacy today?
It's a difficult question. And of course, when you started the War Museum here, it's about D-Day. It would be strange, D-Day and then Anne Frank, but your museum is much bigger. I can compare it with the Imperial War Museum in London, where the museum is for every war United Kingdom has been in. So the museum is very big. When the politicians, so outside the museum, suggested to make a Holocaust wing in the museum, the directors and the staff of the museum protested enormously. That's not our history, they said. There's nothing to do with Holocaust. Of course, it had to do with the Holocaust, but they didn't want it. Nowadays, the Holocaust wing at the Imperial War Museum in London is the most visited part of the of the museum. So you see a change in time. They don't have Anne Frank in the museum, to my knowledge. Maybe they have an Anne Frank tree. There are a lot of Anne Frank trees nowadays, chestnut. But I think it's also Anne Frank became famous, and all her books were sold million-wide after a play was made in the United States. So the American side of Anne Frank, how strange it sounds, is important. So why not here in this museum about the war? And what you say, the Diary of Anne Frank can be a gateway. It's for millions of people the first and sometimes the last book they read about the war, Holocaust. Yeah, it's not only about the Holocaust. Otherwise, people wouldn't buy it, I think. Her legacy now, I'm an historian, so I'm not something who can predict the future. You can say maybe she will become more Jewish, like in the renewed play, she's more Jewish. But when Anne Frank becomes the victim of all evil in the world, then her Jewishness will become smaller, because all the other victims in the world are not all Jewish. Also, a lot of non-Jews who are victims. So it changed in time how, for instance, for the Netherlands. Of course, the book was published for first in the Netherlands. It's 3-4 printings. When a play it was suggested a play would be made in America, a lot of Dutch were very against it. The Americans had to keep their hands off our Anne Frank. But when the play was famous, we found we were proud of ourselves. But it's very, you can say, the Anne Frank House now has 1 million visitors. 40 years ago, Dutch people didn't went to the Anne Frank House, only for tourists. Nowadays, a lot of Dutch people are going there. So you see there is a change in appreciation, in this case, on Anne Frank.
So was there something on your professional path that led you to this work, that led you to the diaries and your work with the Research Institute?
Strangely enough, it was just by coincidence. My director wanted to make a book from it, and he didn't want to work with his old colleagues, the same age. He took 2 very young, still inexperienced scholars with him to do this. And for me, it was also new. And Frank itself, I was not so. Why should I be interested in a 13-year-old girl? I was interested in what happened after the war, and I still am. If people ask, what do you think of Anne Frank? I say, read the diary. I don't know more than you know when you read the diary. But I'm so interested what happened after the war with the legacy, and that everybody does it in a different way. And she has now a kind of famous person status, like what I say, like Kennedy or Elvis Presley. And like there is every few years there is a book about who murdered Kennedy. In the Netherlands, every 3-4 years is a book who betrayed Anne Frank. The books are never complete, so it's. But that makes it interesting. That and I mean, she would have loved it. All this audience. She writes it herself. I want to become famous. Now that is. She became famous, and she will stay famous.
We spoke a lot here about the ending of her story and how it's portrayed differently in plays and the film. But can you tell the audience who may not know what was her ending in reality?
They were arrested in the annex, and arresting sergeants saw a big case, and he said, And that was a case what belongs to officers in the German army. And he asked Otto Frank, is that yours? And Otto said, yes, I've been an officer, lieutenant in the German army in the First World War. And the attitude of this sergeant changed immediately. It was, of course, double. It was a man who hated Jews, but this officer was a superior, more or less. So he said, okay, take it easy. We don't take you immediately. You can get your belongings. It didn't make a difference to their ending, but they all were sent first to Westerbork, transit camp in the Netherlands, and they went to Auschwitz with the last train leaving the Netherlands for Auschwitz. And there the paths were different. In the end, Otto Frank stayed in the hospital of Auschwitz. The elderly people, his wife and the other ones who were in hiding, were killed. He was in the hospital when the camp was liberated by the Russians. And a few weeks before, Anne and Margot were sent westward in a train to Bergen-Belsen, because the Germans didn't want any eyewitnesses alive when the Russians came in. Bergen-Belsen used to be a so-called good camp. Of course, it was never a good camp. It was better than Dachau or Auschwitz. But at that time, it was terrible. And they had too many people, no food, no shelter. Diseases were raging around in the camp. And she and Margot died of typhus in, we don't know exactly when, in March 1945. And it's interesting that after the first night of the play in Hamburg, it's not so far away, youngsters went with flowers to Bergen-Belsen to lay it on the unknown grave, of course, of Anne and Margot. So the play influenced it to show it was their ending.
Two important periods happened that have affected the protection of her legacy, or the protection of how her story is distributed. The passing of Otto Frank in 1980, and then the expiration of the copyright.
Yeah.
How does the passing of her father, how does the expiration of the copyright, how does it affect the 21st century and the retelling of Anne's story, both for good but also possibly for negative, with those who want to insert doubt or outright denial of the Holocaust and the Anne Frank story?
Otto Frank died in 1980. He was 90 years old. And to the surprise of my institute, Institute of War it was called the Institute of War Documentation at that time, only dealing with the Second World War. In his will, he had stated that all the diaries of his daughter would go to my institute. And we were surprised. But most of the staff and the other people were, okay, Diary of Anne Frank, we put it in the archives and that's it. But my director had other plans, and he was much more clever than the rest of us. He said, well, we're going to make a book from it, a real book with footnotes to explain, with introduction, with chapters about the life of the family before they went into hiding, maybe about the betrayal, also chapters about the denial of the diary, because he said there are two reasons to publish it. It's one of the most famous historical documents of the Second World War, and secondly, in the 60s and the 70s, more and more people doubt the authenticity of the diary. When I say more and more, I'm talking about dozens, not about millions. But the few people who doubted the authenticity, they got a lot of publicity. So we also wanted to prove that the diary was written by Anne Frank and by Anne Frank alone. That became a 600 pages book where we shown the difference in her from her first version, the second version, and the version you could buy in the shop. And with a lot of footnotes, not necessary to use them, because we showed when Anne had written a D and skipped it and put a T instead of it. We made a footnote of it to make a real scholarly book. And all of the introduction or chapters, I wrote a chapter about Holocaust deniers, because those deniers of the Holocaust, they were very clever. They thought, if we know that the Diary of Anne Frank is the first and sometimes the last book people reading about this stuff what didn't happen, and if we can prove that the book is not real, then people will also put doubt on the Holocaust. So it's kind of stepping stone theory. And our book has been used in slander trials in Germany. So we're happy about that. Your second question is about the copyright problem. Of course, very important. In most countries, 70 years after the author dies, copyright is free. In this case, it's very complicated with all the translations. Then it's 70 years after the first translation was published, and we're talking about millions and millions, of course. And the Anne Frank Foundation in Switzerland, who owns the copyrights, is defending the copyrights until now. And I don't know what happens in 10 years' time with it. At one time, it will be open to all, I think. You could say, no, the more the better. But then you can also make very different versions of the Diary of Anne Frank. And that makes it more troublesome. Then ask people, they say, I've read the Diary of Anne Frank. Which version do you mean? But that's in the future.
Speaking of the future or of the now, I know you're a historian, but in your view, what is Anne Frank's legacy for today's world?
There is a documentary made about it's before COVID, and people are standing in line for the Anne Frank house to get entrance. And 20 of them are asked, why are you standing here? And it's very fascinating because they all have a different answer. There is an old black man from Alabama, and he say, I'm here because the fight of Anne Frank is a fight of my parents to have equal voting rights, education, etc. So he used Anne Frank for the fight in the South. There are two monks from the Dalai Lama, and say, yeah, the fight of Anne Frank is like for the Dalai Lama. So everybody, there's one who says, yeah, I'm here because Anne Frank suffered from the Holocaust and I don't want to happen that again. So you see, everybody has his or her own part of Anne Frank. And that's also why the book is so popular. I mean, Anne Frank is very young when she's writing, so she doesn't have any strict ideas about religion, politics, or whatever. So everybody can take out of the book what he or she wants. Believers, non-believers, Christians, Muslim, whatever. You can just take a few lines from the book and, oh, that's my Anne Frank. So that's why it's difficult to predict what will happen with her. I know a very small documentary of East German, where Anne Frank was also popular. And their school kids are asked, what's Anne Frank for you? And this is East Berlin. And one girl says, I'm a swimmer. I want to go to the Olympics and get a medal in name of Anne Frank. And there is a boy, he said, I want to join the army in the name of Anne Frank. So Anne Frank is used for everything, by everybody.
The museum's mission here is to tell the story of the American experience in the war that changed the world, why it was fought, how it was won, and what it means today. That last leg of the mission, what it means today, is something that we strive to do through exhibits, but also through programs and interviews to talk about the lasting lessons and legacies, but also the memory of the war. And David Barnouw, your book, The Phenomenon of Anne Frank, does a wonderful job of getting to this lasting legacy of just one person, but one person who is universally referenced and admired. So thank you for bringing this deep backstory to light. Thank you for sharing your insights today. And thank you for being here with us in New Orleans.
Thank you for having me here.